In this video, you will learn the basics of the NIST Risk Management Framework and the 6 key steps of that standard: categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor. I will show you effective risk handling strategies so you can protect your organization from vulnerabilities. You also learn how to assess, evaluate, and implement risk management controls. So let's get started. Introduction to Organizational Security Risk Management. Hi everyone! In this first video, we are going to talk about introduction to the Risk Management Framework, what it involves, and we will try really hard to understand by the end of this section some key concepts such as the role and the importance of the risk management to the cybersecurity process, the issues associated with the generic risk management, what is the form and the exact content of the risk management process, and many more. So please stick to the videos that I'm gonna present you in that section, and let's get started with introducing you to the RMF. So the main goal of this course, and specifically this section, is to provide you with very comprehensive understanding of the strategic risk management process, and you will be able to also understand the main principles and standards for the Risk Management Framework, RMF. So the Risk Management Framework includes a formal set of steps that every company should carry out in order to protect its assets from harm that might be caused by hackers, other companies, or pretty much people that want to steal your information or money. So risk management, as you can see, is very important, and also you really need to understand it in order to minimize it. So the risk management involves a very systematic, well-structured and comprehensive set of controls to prevent unauthorized use, loss, damage, disclosure, or modification of the organizational information. And in this section specifically, we will discuss the formal process for identifying, managing, and mitigating risk as presented by the institute that actually create the risk management framework, or this is the National Institute of the Standards and Technology in US, or in short terms you can just call it NIST. So here we will also discuss the general uses for the framework and the main context in which it applies. So you can take this section in this course as a standardization guidelines for every company that want to deal with risk management. So if you're working in a company like this, or your organization is not sure how to handle risk, well, here we're going to provide you with exact guidelines and processes to implement that in a very flexible way that can be adopted and modified by any organization. We will also discuss and center on how the NIST RMF can be used for deploying appropriate set of informational technology security controls. We'll also lay out issues involved in implementing the standard processes, including the benefits for deriving those processes and all the potential risks there. I will also try to give you a very good explanation, and you'll be able to gain good understanding of the implementation process, which is very well explained in the RMF specific context. So if you think why we need to actually have any sort of risk or cybersecurity frameworks, this is because of the main concept that the risk is actually inevitable. So risk is a very big part of our life. Any situation or any action that we're doing involves some sort of risk. So if we get used to the idea that the risk is inevitable, then we should actually try to take measures in order to calculate that risk, to see what is the probability of that risk, how important that risk is for us, and then when an accident occur, how to minimize the impact involved within that accident. So as you can see on the figure in front of you, there are many types of risks that are involved within the organization, and those could be supply chain risk, web app attacks, lawsuits, payments taken by scammers, and they can result loss of customers, losing assets, and so on and so on. The list is very long. So whether risk assessment involves decisions about major corporate initiatives or just making the decision to walk down the street. We're always anticipating, identifying, evaluating all the potential risks involved. In that respect, it can be said that we're constantly managing risks in everything we do. And with our work, it's completely the same. So the reason why the risk management is particularly important aspect of the cybersecurity body and knowledge is that the information and the communication technology are information assets that are very difficult to account for, and it is also very difficult to control them comparing to the physical assets. So the informational and communication technology, it is quite difficult to identify and secure just because of the fact it involves the production and management of virtual, highly dynamic products. So this particularly puts the risk management stage into consideration on how to establish and maintain secure ICT environment. By definition, the ICT assets are something of a great value for a business. The risk management process specifically ensures three generic protection criteria. Those three criteria can really ensure you that you are prevented from a very meaningful loss of your assets within your organization. So let's talk about those three criteria. So you can see them on the triangle in front of you, and those are confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or you can call them shortly CIA. So the most logical generic criteria is the assurance against the loss of confidentiality. So in all means, confidentiality is a security practice that ensures that the organization has requirements to restrict access to many sensitive information and data that it keeps. Obviously, if the organization data and information could be made public without risk, there would be not a really big need of this attribute for securing and making the information confidential. From the operational point of view, confidentiality is funded to establish and adequately enforces access control. So you're basically controlling the access to the information that you are creating. And this should be really one of the first things that you should establish in your company or department. This is because data and information are essential to the business operations. And in many information-intensive organizations, it might be the only real asset to keep. For instance, a formal data within the company is sensitive, at least most of it. So one of the best ways actually to find the value of the confidentiality is to actually imagine how much your competitors might pay to have access to the data and the information of your company, and the cost of litigation if the legal requirements were evaluated. So in that respect, the organization always have legal and ethical requirements to protect its sensitive business information as well as the employee or the customer's privacy. So the second characteristic is the integrity. So the intended process of the integrity of data is determined based on how authentic, accurate, and complete the data is. It is easy to appreciate the value of the integrity in the context of the financial business transactions. For example, if a bank could not depend on its account balances, it could potentially sustain a large loss by sending checks that are not covered by any type of funds. So in an inventory system, for example, there is always a potential to lose expensive materials if you didn't count them accurately. So in that case, you would always need to keep count of all the components and materials that your business have in order for you not losing physical assets. So as you can see in the bank example, on one side, the assets that you could be losing or getting into trouble because you actually don't have them are virtual, because banks in most cases are working with, of course, money that are sent in a virtual way, while on the other side you're losing physical assets. However, in both cases, either those are virtual or physical, you're actually losing assets and potentially money as well. Okay, so I think you actually grasp quite good the confidentiality and the integrity. So let's talk now about availability. So availability means and ensures that the information is provided to authorized user when it is required. So the best way to understand the value of the availability is to ask, what would happen if the information was not available to support a given action or decision? And of course, I can give you an example for that. So what would happen if the business payroll data were erased on the payday, if the payroll program was suddenly unoperative? So in that case, no one in the organization would be paid as expected. Imagine the chaos in a company such as Google or Facebook if they were unable to pay their employees and suppliers on the exact date that they promised. This would of course introduce a great harm, and not having actually right risk management procedures can lead to potential harm when putting into the risk the unavailability or the availability in new resources. So because every organization is actually unique and implements security quite differently, the actual process to identify, evaluate, and ensure that the risk that is worth protecting from each of the SIA areas is actually properly managed, well, this involves some requirements. In fact, there are exactly 8 requirements that involve the proper management of a risk. So let's talk a little bit about those. So the first one states that identifiable actions must be taken to ensure correct, confidential, and available information. The next rule in order to manage SIA properly is that all relevant areas of risk must be considered any given solution. So what this means is that when you're making your plan for defining solution for potential risks, you should always make sure that all the relevant areas of risk are considered. So all the topics that I mentioned in the previous slide, which were confidentiality, integrity, and availability, should always be considered when we're taking decisions. The next rule basically covers responsibility, or who is responsible, or who we're going to blame if something goes wrong or we get an incident. So always the responsibility of a risk should be always exactly assigned to individuals or individual employees or team, and should be well understood by them. Everybody that is responsible for protecting certain assets should be aware about this, so he knows that it's his job to protect those assets, and he's the one that we're going to blame if those assets get vulnerable. And this brings us to the next rule, which is related to the accountability, and this says that a system of accountability and enforcement for the risk must exist. And not only that, but I would advise you that accountability should always be documented. So you should have a piece of paper who is accountable for what type of assets, and especially if an incident happened, you know who to hold accountable for that. And also, if you have the proper documentation, you'll be able to enforce penalties to the responsible one. I know this sometimes sounds cruel, but this is how the proper risk management procedures work. So let's talk about the next rule. Now, the risk assessment is not something that you're doing once, or something that you're doing once you create your company and you stop doing. You should do it actually quite regularly. So you should always schedule risk assessments that should happen between certain period of time. So let's say every quarter or every year, you should always look for procedures to improve your risk management and assessment. So you should always have a good assessment for the current risks and the new risks to come, depending on the new assets that you gain or the new business that you're performing. So in order to be able to train your staff and employees for how to deal with the risk, they should all understand the importance of the risk. And you cannot expect from your employees or from your team to perform a good risk management and learn how to mitigate risk if they're actually not understanding and think that this is something important. You should try providing your teammates with examples or real-time cases which will actually show them how important risk management is. And here we will go to the, in my opinion, the most important rule about risk management, and this is that the investment into risk management should always be appropriate depending on the impact that this risk could create. And what I mean by this is, if you have a risk that could cost you $100 to fix, there is no point investing $200 for protecting your organization from that risk to happen, right? because it is simple. Even if that risk grows into incident, the maximum money that you can use is $100. However, if you invest into risk management, you might lose more money than an actual incident will cost you. So in that case, there is absolutely no point to invest into managing this risk. And of course, every company is performing a business, so in the end of the day, you want your calculations to be correct. So you should do a very good estimation on how much a risk would cost you, and is it appropriate in that case to invest into risk management in order not to lose those assets. And finally, of course, we have to touch the topic of ethics, because every risk should be ethically managed. This means that if you have to do illegal activity to manage this risk, you might not consider that way of doing it, because you might face illegal penalties and eventually get out of business. So in practice, organizations should design, implement, and follow strategic process for establishing a persistent organizational risk management process. This design and management process involves short and long-range considerations. And this is because planning for strategic risk management is necessary in order to ensure continuous risk assurance. And it's quite important to establish formal strategic planning process to implement a proper organization-wide risk management process. So as I said, risk management procedure should be quite flexible, so the risk management itself must incorporate all the elements of the business within its scope. So if you need to modify the framework to apply to your needs, you could and you actually should definitely do that. And this will enable the framework to really reach the boundaries of the organization. So the outcome of implementing the risk management process should be a concrete organization risk management scheme that is documented. So this risk management scheme will balance the aims of the long-term risk control policy with the real-world conditions and dealing with customers. So the atomic level components of the risk management process are a set of substantive security controls that ensure level of assurance against loss. So the security controls are actions that you are basically taken, or actions to control the cybersecurity in your organization. They should be traceable directly to the individual policies that identify their need. For example, your organization might have needs to contact external vendor, so based on that, you should be able to establish a good cybersecurity policies in order to ensure that you protect this data when working with the vendor. This closed loop process is a good alignment of the risk security controls with your current company policies. So applying this strategy would ensure quite good efficiency of your organizational setting. Sometimes the exact risk that your organization is facing might not be well understood. So in that case, the overall quality process requires a good definition of what the risk management means. And in that case, we are talking about standardization. This is important because if you are lacking of effective, coordinated implementation and execution of the process, would make the overall risk management efforts quite ineffective. Moreover, the employees might take the cybersecurity not quite seriously. So in order to prove to the employees that the risk management is quite important, you can simply provide them with a list of the recent incidents that were created due to cybersecurity gaps in your organization. So here in front of you guys, you can see again the formal reference model of the risk management framework RMF. So this model that you can see serves both as specification for the fundamental process for understanding the risk that is involved when you're trying to protect and assure your information, and also here you're going to see the foundation in deploying common control mechanisms. So those mechanisms are actually required to manage risks which exist within the organization. So you can see that the process is very simple, and this graph has advantage for providing a good definition of the processes for achieving even federal information security management. And you can see the main steps for ensuring the risk. So we're starting from categorizing the information system, as you can see, and here we should combine two things: the architecture descriptions or what is going to be the architecture of the reference models for ensuring cybersecurity, and also the organizational input such as laws, directives, policy guidance, and so on. So this is what's involved in the categorization. Once we ensure that we categorized our system, then we need to select the security controls. Okay, so let's say we identified our risks, and now we want to select some controls in order to assure that our organization is protected from those risks. So once we design and decide what security controls we want to implement in order to protect our organization, the next step is to implement them. So we will have some sort of deployment strategy for implementing the security controls that are already completed, and this strategy would involve the time frame and the cost for implementing that. Then we're going to go to step 4, where we're going to assess the security controls, which means that we're going to start working with them in order to manage the risk. The next step is to authorize and to prove that all the assets are protected with the security controls that we just created. And finally, once we have established process, what's left is simply to monitor if this process works correctly, and also to monitor new risks that might be apparent for your organization, or potential introduction of new security controls. So this approach is appropriate for any organizational setting. In essence, the generic governance model shows a flexible top-down, as you can see, organizational process for establishing persistent risk management actions by proper selection and maintenance of appropriate security controls, as you just saw. Moreover, since the RMF is funded on already established policy, it is able to capture and communicate the nature of the specific risk that any organization might encounter. And moreover than this, since framework itself is built and maintained through comprehensive identification and assessment process, it can assist in rationally and systematically changes identification and treat any environment in which an incident might occur. So this was the end of the lesson today, guys. I hope you learned quite a lot, and there's way more to learn regarding the risk management process. Thanks for watching, and in the next video we're going to talk about the strategic governance in the risk management. Thanks for watching. So if you already learned a lot about the NIST Risk Management Framework, but you want to learn even more, you can get access to our complete NIST Risk Management Framework course. There I will dedicate over 2 hours for each step of the NIST RMF. This means by taking the course, you easily become an expert in this valuable framework. Now you can get 50% off by simply using the link in the description. So let's get back to the video. Strategic governance and risk management. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the course. In this video, we're going to talk about the strategic governance and the main elements of the risk management. So what we mean here by governance is the way that you implement the risk management strategies in your company. You always should try implementing those strategies organization-wide. And this is because the risk management is actually a strategic issue. It is not some technical concern that you need to fix, and after that you don't need to worry about it. You really need to implement a process with strategies and approaches to deal with risk in your company. So the reason to adopt organization-wide risk management approach is to avoid having uncertainty between the different departments. For example, if one department has certain risk management strategies, but another one has different business practices, and depending on those business practices, it has different risk management process, then when those two departments interact, there will definitely be leaks, which will include more vulnerabilities to your business process. So when you do not implement your risk management strategies organization-wide, but within the different department, those strategies are very often based on major ideas about the proper way to accomplish a particular organizational goal. And regardless where they're universally standard or documented, they will have a problem. And the problem is that those approaches are often not coordinated efficiently in the operational environment. And in some cases, they can really cause a very big dysfunctional conflict within your teams. And unfortunately, this is the case in many companies. Organizations develop specific one-time responses as risk present to themselves, rather than addressing them by employing a single coordinated management strategy. So an alternative approach to the one that I just mentioned is to have formally defined and instantiated architecture of comprehensive risk management and its best practices. In that way, companies usually aim to organize the risk controls within the company. So the problem here comes from the fact that this is quite a complex system. So in that case, the formal risk management practice can only be implemented if the company also implements rational and explicit planning process. So usually, using this approach, the first one that you can see here, is actually sometimes quite beneficial, but here the planning activity fits the strategic purposes and responsibilities of standards-based risk management to the security needs of the organization. So this means that this can be extended, and the NIST Risk Management Framework adds the creation of strategic risk management capabilities to that. So before talking about how risk is basically governed by the NIST Cybersecurity and Risk Management Framework, let's talk about how the risk is built. Basically, the risk management is built around information. So our aim is always to gather and utilize information from all possible sources in order to decrease the possibility of incidents or failures within our organization in the future, as you can see. So in order to do this information gathering from all resources, I emphasize on that, we need to of course apply certain processes and techniques to do the information gathering activity. So in its core, the risk management framework relies on the ability to assure that processes, practices, knowledge and skills of risk management to quickly and efficiently, actually as quickly and efficiently as possible, the decision-making process is finalized and the risk is neutralized. We can also add to that the risk management framework also includes commonly accepted and strategic set of policies and procedures that are there to handle risk. So those procedures ensure that the risk planning, analysis, response, and the process management functions are always directly aligned to the goals of your business operation. So the primary purpose of the risk management is to ensure a disciplined response to risk that the organizations consider priority. So let's now talk about the elements of the risk management. In simple terms, the risk management process assesses the possibility of any given action to impact in a negative way the value of a given asset or entity within your organization. This could also include health, memory, money, life, everything. So once we make those risks known to the organization management team and actually the employees as a whole, now we can actually deploy all the measures that are necessary to ensure that future harm will not occur. There are of course some organizations that manage risk in highly quantified and data-driven way. For example, corporations that require very high level of integrity in their products or certain segments of their critical infrastructure. Other companies tend to spend less on risk management, and the spending levels by the nature are quite influenced by the value and the sensitivity of the assets that are in risk. I think I mentioned before that if your assets are not that valuable for you, you might consider putting them into risk if the loss from that risk is not going to be higher than the loss or the money that you need to invest in order to protect them. You should always make sure that you assess your process, and this is because the identification and the understanding are one of the most important aspects of the risk management. The risk management is operated by a continuous process of assessing the organization environment, where we should aim to identify and understand all the potential threats and the negative impacts that those threats might cause to our business. So once we have identified and characterized those threats, the focus after that would be to find the specific steps to implement and mitigate any adverse outcomes that would happen from that risk. So because of the fact that the NIST risk management framework is quite focused on decision making, one of the most important factors that really need to be underlined when doing risk evaluation is the uncertainty principle. So the uncertainty is one of the key elements in assessing threats because every risk has future consequences. What this means in simple words is that the outcome of any given threat have to be fully understood in order for us to be able to make an intelligent decision based on that. Of course, in any case or in any company that is facing threat, there can always be number of unknown and therefore unevaluated factors that might be associated with a given threat to your company. So for that reason, you should make sure that there is a department or a person responsible for building standards, persistence, identification, and that understands the risk management process. So in fact, it is true that it is way easier to identify and evaluate risk at less complex environments. So the more complex environment you have, the more difficult would be with you to define and address risk issues. And yes, every aspect of the cyberspace is abstract and complex. And for that reason, unlike the other areas, the risk management for cybersecurity requires much different approach to the understanding and the evaluating of risk. So in that case, when we try to implement risk management process into the virtual world, this would touch factors that would normally not be a part of the decision-making process on the physical world. And in fact, with the increasing of the number of our systems and the IT industry as a whole, there is huge increase of the number of strategic threats to computers, network, which also introduce threat to the modern way of living. And you know, everybody is using those systems, computers, smartphones, everything is connected. So a risk introduced to those systems could affect anyone, and in more particular, your personal data. So I bet that you heard the terms such as cybercrime, cyber terrorism, or cyber war. All of them, they're valid because stealing and exchanging information can cause a lot of issues for everyone. So for that reason, in the past 15 years, we can really see the creation of a completely new profession that is dedicated for addressing all the level of risks in the virtual world. And this profession is precisely named cybersecurity. So definitely, by having the experience that you would gain from this course, you would have the right resume for pursuing this job opportunity. The aim of the cybersecurity specialist is to assure that all the IT systems and the information that they contain are protected against all the logical forms of unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, inspection, recording, and so on and so on. So the cybersecurity evolved out of practices and procedure of a discipline that was actually initially created to protect data, and this discipline was called information assurance. So one of the key aspects of the organizational discipline when performing information assurance was who is responsible to manage all risks related to use, processing, storage, transmission of information, and also who is responsible about the systems and the processes that are put into place in order to cope with this assurance. So at the same time, the cybersecurity is more concerned on protection of all aspects of the risk mitigation into the virtual and the physical space. So when we're concerned about cybersecurity, all of those, they should be included in the protection scheme. And to do that, companies must incorporate all means of electronic tools, documentation, and training for their employees. So this assignment, I would say, is not a simple computer science challenge. It really requires a lot of knowledge and practice from a wide range of traditional security fields, such as continuity management, audit management science, software, system engineering, even fields of law, such as criminology. So this is why NIST reached the solution when they concluded that what is required to manage cybersecurity risks is a complete, provably effective framework that ensures proper coordination and use of all appropriate methods in execution of the risk management process. So this framework re-executes proved and correct approaches into a single and logical coherent model of operation. So the risk management framework is really an advice to the companies, and it has different elements, so every company can take different things from it. It is quite flexible. So you can have your current company operations, but you can enhance them by applying this framework. So the key concept that the risk management framework has is that it needs to be commonly accepted. And this is because when you have a commonly accepted methods, this ensures that your company establish a standard point of reference. So this sort of unified version is necessary to establish coordination actions when you manage risk. And comprehensive coordination is necessary. This is because all potential risk must be identified, assessed, and responded to at all levels within your organization. So this solution, I should say, is quite a big problem for the average managers. So for that reason, if you're a manager, you might really face problems with that. This is because the normal, conventional managers simply do not have the background or the training to identify every potential risk. So you can really not expect from them to find methods to mitigate risk. So given the level and the skills and the sophistication of large collection of hackers and malicious agents out there, it is critically important to implement comprehensive organization-wide protection, since any system that is not covered by risk management framework has the potential to get hacked and is vulnerable. For that reason, it's always been necessary, and this is a huge requirement for anyone working into the cybersecurity profession, to establish and maintain a standard of comprehensive point of reference that he or her can utilize to structure a practical risk management solution for their specific situation. So it is quite a good idea to consider employing a single, commonly recognized standard which specifies a single effective method for risk management. Also, it is quite difficult to explore all the organizational resources and get the ones that are needed for the most effective assurance strategy for your organization. Of course, any risk can be managed if we throw enough money into it. However, the organizations don't have the resources to effectively protect themselves from every possible risk. So managers must weigh and balance the deployment of their risk response and define the particular likelihood and the materials needed to protect the organization from a threat. In the day-to-day commercial operations, this means that it must be possible to take an uniform decision about the level of risk that can be acceptable in any given situation. And given the layers of complexity, this is a quite difficult task with a cybersecurity risk, especially when the decision is weighted against the possible cost of failure. So you always need to establish a coherent set of best practices and methods. This would help to the decision makers to find and plan the existing risk management resource usage using not maybe the most expert advice, but the most expert advice available in their specific strategic measurement tool. This is because the drive for comprehensive advantage and the need for cost efficiency have driven corporations toward growing dependence on technology. And because of that, the impacts of the ICT risks have become increasingly critical factor for the organizations. And moreover, given that technology, it experiences rapid and dynamic change. So for that reason, the risk management should be constantly researched and new practices should be adopted. So those conditions really justify the role of NIST when developing the guidelines about the risk management. So the NIST RMF was designed to offer a structured and flexible means of analyzing and deciding how to deal with risks that arise from information systems within certain organization. So the idea of adopting coordinated set of formal risk management practices is actually a relatively new concept. It's really been developed in the past 10 years. So all the risk management approaches available are specified in the risk management framework, and for that reason they are intentionally broad-based. This is because those recommendations are meant to dictate how to assess risk and employ the appropriate risk management strategies for all IT organizations. So the framework implies the need of a single umbrella model that defines the elements and the relationships of the risk management process. The specific steps for risk management take place within the structure created by the model, and those are captured already by the appropriate supporting NIST and security standards and guidelines that apply to a particular problem. So for every problem that your organization might have, there is a guideline to address that problem and to help you develop solutions for deal with this problem. So those are all the elements of risk that I wanted to discuss with you today, guys. Thanks for watching that video, and in the next one we're going to talk about the key risk types and handling strategies. Thanks for watching. Risk types and risk handling strategies. Hi everyone and welcome back to the course. In this video we're going to talk about the risk types and the risk handling strategies. There are 4 strategies that are generally employed when dealing with risk. The first strategy is the accept of risk and the consequent losses. The second strategy is to avoid the loss by performing the necessary actions to eliminate the risk. The third strategy is to mitigate or reduce the effects of the risk, and the last strategy involves transferring the risk to another party or partners to your company. So no matter what approach you decide to use, either the first one, the second one, or the last ones, the organization always have to adopt a common strategy to decide how to address each of those risk categories. In the same way, regardless of circumstances, the decision about what to do is purely a decision of the decision maker, and this would be either you, if you are responsible for the risk management in your company, or some employee or the department that is dealing with the risk. So let's first talk about accepting the risk and the consequent losses. This is one of the most common approaches that are used out there when you are dealing with risk, or especially with risk that rarely occurs. Some risks just are not worth it enough for you to invest any resources in dealing with them. So for that reasons, many risks might pass the corporate risk management functions because the cost of addressing those risks simply cannot justify the potential cost or harm from that risk in your company. The decision to accept a risk can also change the risk situation. So if the risk situation, for example, changes, then you can definitely apply some of the other 3 categories that I'm going to talk about later. So only use this first strategy that I'm mentioning to you when there is no harm, or if the harm exists and you justified that the present harm from that risk is acceptable. So you can build residuals, or you can build a table or graph to see the potential risks related to that issue and try to predict the cost for dealing with those risks, or how much is going to cost if you accept it, or risking your company to be vulnerable for a particular risk that involves low losses. So let's talk about the next strategy, and here we're going to use one very key word, which is the avoid word. So with the second strategy, you're trying to avoid risk, and if you apply the strategies that I'm going to mention to you in this course, you succeed in that. So the risk avoidance aims to prevent a risk to actually occur in your company. So the information security 3 standard components, which are prevention, detection, and response. The prevention, for example, involves building key strategies in your company to train your employees risk avoidance. Training programs which are designed to increase the ability of employees to recognize and respond to incidents are good examples for this type of risk handling approach. The information security process is heavily geared towards avoidance in order to reduce as much as possible the amount of harm by addressing the risk directly. And what I mean by addressing is trying to identify what this particular risk is and making specific strategies for avoiding it. So the last 2 portions of the information security process, detection and response, are pretty much called risk mitigation and risk transferring approaches. So in the case of transferring risk, the response for dealing with risk is not required by you, but it is required by third party, which takes the full responsibility. So you would normally work with some third party that would assume and get all the impact of the risk. And in the real world, this is called insurance. And I will use insurance as an example here. So obtaining insurance against specific risk does not actually prevent the risk from occurring, but it provides financial reimbursement to make up for the loss of the risk that occurred. So risk transfer work well when the risk is associated with financial loss. However, sometimes the risks are not associated only with financial loss, but also with losing information. So for example, let's say that your company has a risk that involves customer service or retentions the organization reputation, which is probably one of the most important assets that organization has, or risk that involves your company not meeting some regulatory requirements and getting out of business. Those are really risks that you cannot transfer to another party since they're not financial. So finally, let's talk a little bit about the risk mitigation. So the risk mitigation are basically the steps that organization takes to minimize the potential loss in event of occurrence of a risk. For instance, an intrusion detection system will not prevent someone from actually intruding to the network. Instead, the intrusion detection system that is going to create functions that manage hacker alarms to limit the time that the intruder is allowed to go around undetected within your network. Of course, the limitation of time will not prevent damage, but instead, it will definitely prevent the amount of damage that some inappropriate action would cause to your systems. For example, there are many companies that set the time that you might be logged into your account to only 5 minutes. So after 5 minutes inactivity, your account will be logged out. In the same way, you can set some time parameters when certain connection is established with your company, and after this time parameters to disable it. That way would really ensure that if somebody gets access, after some time he would be kicked out from the network. So one thing that is quite important for the risk management framework is that it provides a very specific basis for creating and mitigating very comprehensive risk management controls for absolutely every aspect of your business information assets. The objective of the risk management framework is to provide a common sense basis to develop, implement, and measure effective risk management practices for your company. So this is done by implementing the risk management framework to almost all departments in your organization and aligning all of your business departments to be compliant with the NIST framework guidelines and be able to easily follow the risk management framework process. So the main goal of the risk management framework is to define and communicate very commonly accepted and standard basis for building best practices for risk management. So RMF compares the risk management practices of an organization against threats and vulnerabilities that this particular organization faces and prescribes a systematic mitigation approach to address those. So this particular framework is designed to enable the ICT manager to really increase their levels of risk awareness among their employees. So the risk management framework, it really allows the companies to identify common gaps in their risk management process. It also would allow your company or companies of all sizes to demonstrate the effectiveness of their risk management program and apply those programs to really increase their investment practices protection. So you should remember that the risk management framework also assures risk management capability to any outside entities because it provides the ability to audit and to get organization certified. So it provides a certification evidence on whether the company is able to mitigate risks or not. So for example, if you want to implement the risk management framework, you should always document the risks that you have considered and how those risks would affect your assets. You need to have control measures to protect yourself against the risk. Those measures themselves are commonly understood as correct and are specified by the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the RMF provides risk-based assessment model for deploying the controls necessary to obtain formal certification of compliance with the NIST standards. So from a marketing perspective, certifying to the RMF standards can also provide basis for better selling of your current informational technology products. In that respect, the presence of the audited and certified security system becomes a true means of demonstrating the commitment of certain organization to properly address its cybersecurity protection. In order to identify a risk and to do a systematic mitigation approach, you need to have risk management practices in place. You need to identify all of the threats and vulnerabilities within your company, and also to identify the gaps into the risk processes, threats, and vulnerabilities. And I would say that the last one is the most important, because when you identify the gaps that your organization or your business has, you'll be better in understanding and mitigating the risk. So in the cases where you want to put into place auditable proof of compliance, so for example, you want to gain a document for meeting the NIST standards, you would need to invite in your company external auditors that will be able to determine whether your organization has adopted the commonly accepted means to deploy its standard cybersecurity system within your organization. So doing this process, I would advise you to do it actually, because this is really likely to make the certification and the accreditation of your company way easier. And if you put all of those practices into place, the process will be way more efficient, as well as it will support your company to any future cybersecurity attacks. So besides those advantages, the RMF approach also offers some operational benefits. Because cybersecurity tends to be tactical and reactive by nature, since you're always waiting for the bad guys to show up. On the other hand, if the defense in-depth scheme is based on principles that are complete, so organizations can initiate a full-scale set of procedures designed to prevent rather than remediate threats and work more proactively. The RMF process applies a management basis for identifying and organizing a comprehensive set of common best practices that the organization needs to establish and maintain control over the ICT risks. So since the risk management framework was designed to meet the needs and is applicable to a range of ICT environments, it has the potential to deploy all the necessary cybersecurity assurance elements to ensure an organization's systems are protected throughout the life cycle. So the RMF applies equality to building assurance as well as the long-term maintenance of assurance for information sets. These activities in the risk management framework apply independently whether the actual system development and maintenance is performed whether internally or externally to the organization. The system evaluation approach applicable to the definition of the cybersecurity solution for single system or multiple sites may even be applied on sharing basis between multiple parties. It can be captured and expressed in everything from informational agreements up to legally binding contracts. So because the RMF touches on every aspect of how to assess and manage risk, it forces companies to a step-by-step evolution of their needs and responsibilities to their ICT function. Despite that, the process itself is quite generic, which means that a generic assessment and implementation approach must be adopted to fit into the particular situation of your business. So it would be responsibility of your organization to apply an optimal approach out of the risk management framework model for your organization. So the understanding of risk that the risk management framework provides and the appropriate set of control objectives selected from NIST compose of the actual form of the eventual response. So once all the threats and vulnerabilities for your company are identified and their likelihood for happening and impacting your organization is assessed, then you should immediately put in place policies that are defined in the particular area that those risks apply. So in the real world, day-to-day procedures or individual tasks should be assigned to each individual role within the risk management process and the team that is mitigating the risk. So you should create some sort of risk instructions for a particular area of identified risk. So the final result would be an explicit set of risk management actions which are based on a standard framework that is accommodated depending on your threats. That's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching that section. I hope you very well understood the risk types and the handling strategies. Thanks for watching, and in the next video we're going to talk about the overview of the risk management process. Thanks for watching. Overview of the risk management process. Hi guys, in this video I'm gonna give you a good overview of the risk management process. So the primary role of the risk management plan is to create a framework of detailed policies and procedures that will address the risk management process for a particular organization. So the top-level risk management plan provides the strategic context that is needed to ensure the organization's overall business objectives and goals are made properly and the right decisions are accepted about risk. So what you would need to do is to write the overall plan for the risk management needs on a board. You should call different organizational teams and they should elaborate with specific details the approaches that will be adopted. So it is quite important that this high-level plan defines the comprehensive process to build the complete picture of the organizational risk situation. Of course, in the ideal world, it would be the most appropriate to create a roadmap that will let the executive managers develop the strategies they will need to address existing risks. The first thing is that the risk management plan should be documented and all the roles and the responsibilities applicable to that risk should be applied to your team members. So the assessment of responsibility would be started at a high enough level to allow the people on the risk management team to respond in a flexible manner to all the situations that you actually covered in the plan about managing risk. So the risk management plan has to assign a specific authority to the team to act in those situations that are specific responsibility for the risk management process. The assignment of high-level roles and responsibilities also ensures that the supervisory authority is specifically assigned to individual members of the team. So the concepts associated with the risk management has to be written on a document and defined really well with quite specific terms. This definition is quite important in order to align the organization's overall security objectives with the business objectives. In that respect, a comprehensive and detailed definition of key terms has to be provided as part of the planning setup process. The main purpose of those definitions is to ensure that a common vocabulary is used throughout the organization. So all of your teammates should get together, make a plan, and you should really ensure that each member of the team uses the same terms and there is good understanding between them so they can build a plan. Those definitions are very important, and this is because the understanding of most people on what risk is very subjective. For that reason, it is recommended that the organization provides a precise specification on what constitutes a risk, the levels of the acceptable risk, and the attempted approaches that will be used to address that risk. So you need to ensure that you have a specific terms on how to address risk, how to report risk, and how to make the thresholds acting on the risk reports. And finally, you can build specific requirements that will actively apply to all the accepted and non-accepted risks. So that was everything for that video, guys. Thanks for watching, and in the next one we're going to talk about how we can identify and categorize the risk environment. Thanks for watching. Identifying categories for the risk environment. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the course. The next step in establishing effective risk management is to have a complete understanding and knowledge of the threat environment. That knowledge requires a very good record of all organizational assets. You might also consider to create statements for the acceptable levels of risk for each asset and constraints that will be placed on the protection of the asset by the available resources, technologies, and existing policies. The outcome of the threat catalog process will ensure alignment of all the policies, and this will be used for risk management depending on the business goals of the organization. That alignment is needed to conduct the trade-off process. So if you don't know what a trade-off process is, well, this will be used to decide the risk acceptance, avoidance, or risk transference strategy that will be used to ensure that all of your assets are addressed. When those trade-offs are planned, they should accurately reflect the organization's business objectives. An analysis of the priority of information that enables the business objectives versus the threats is very necessary in order to decide where to invest the organization's security resources. So, defining the risk levels needs to be done with respect to the impact of the organizational data and resources. So, the risk management coordinates three highly related factors within the organization. Those are the risks that can be associated with organization systems, the business functions that are associated with the information in those systems, and the extent of control necessary to manage each of those risks. The key to success lies in deploying minimum number of controls to achieve a desired level of assurance, gain the intended purposes for each affected business function. So there are two different ways to carry the risk control deployment process. So one of the most common ways for dealing with risk, or actually deploying process that will control the risk, is called the ad hoc method. In the case of the ad hoc method, the controls are created to fulfill specific security needs. Those needs normally arise when the threat is identified. So many organizations use the ad hoc approach to risk management simply because the development of a coordinated set of controls is a difficult process, especially to manage on day-to-day basis. The ad hoc approach is cost-effective because it only creates controls that are needed at that particular time. Nevertheless, it is almost certain that you would have the right reaction to protect your assets because organizations are reacting to events that are occurring rather than developing controlled protection to prevent them from happening at the first place. So the next approach, as you can see, is the coordinated approach. This approach means to provide comprehensive protection and definitely offers more effective risk management. It deploys a series of mitigation-based baselines, and you can build a defense-in-depth scheme that consists of both technical and behavioral controls. In most baselines, the electronic controls are automated, while the behavioral controls consist of series of well-defined human-centered actions and trainings. So each baseline is deployed to achieve specific risk management objectives and is prioritized in terms of the criticality of the data. The negative aspects here are that the creation, deployment, and the ongoing monitoring of those baselines is both time-consuming and costly. For that reason, the degree of assurance justified under the scheme always has to be balanced depending on the level of effort and cost that is required to implement that approach and maintain it. The main goal of the coordinated approach is to deal only with the priority risks for the organization. So it really takes an active coordination to create and maintain effective array of behaviors while using this approach. So because of the fact that during this approach some of your needs might be quite costly, it is very important for you to make a realistic plan. It is quite necessary to have some sort of specification for the maximum level of risk that could appear, and also understanding what level of risk your organization is willing to accept and can afford. The decision about the degree of risk that organization is willing to accept will definitely lead to assignment of priorities. So understanding the value of certain item or asset enables your company to make a specific decision about what is priority and what is not a priority. So the priorities can drive decisions around the practical form of response. The value assigned is typically expressed as the level of acceptability of the risk. So you would either find yourself in situations that you want to spend whatever it takes to ensure that the risk does not occur, or some risks simply do not justify the cost addressed to them. So in order to decide about the level of risk, the decision maker has to first know the value of the information that the organization possesses. So decision about the acceptability of risk leads always directly to coordinated security response, which is great for everyone. So the risk management process involves a technique that establishes substantive, usually resource-based, connection between identifying the threat and the benefits on managing it. So operational factors that enter into that analysis include issues such as what is the level of criticality of each particular information asset and what is the specific degree of the resources involved. Therefore, threat to risk evaluations have to answer one key question at minimum. What is the trade-off between accepting the risk and the harm that this risk can cause? That's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching that video, and I will see you in the next one. Risk assessment. Hi guys, and welcome back to the course. The overall purpose of risk management function is to maintain the most appropriate sets of risk controls. For that reason, there should always be ongoing assessments because they are quite critical for the overall purpose. Those ongoing assessments are required because all of the control sets have to be periodically assessed in order to ensure that their protection is relevant and their effectiveness is always maintained. So risk assessments are quite important because they identify the specific threats in the organization, how likely those threats are to occur, and the consequences for each threat that would happen. Because knowing where risks lie is something foundational for managing risks, the term risk assessment is sometimes used with the same meaning as risk management. In addition to that, risk assessment is not the same as risk management. Obviously, knowing the likelihood and the impact of each potential threat is essential thing to do when we want to manage risk. So risk assessment is a tool that supports the larger term risk management function. So the risk assessment defines the overall strategy that is used to deploy the risk management process. So those risk assessments inform managers on where to deploy the necessary reactive controls to respond to risk. The risk assessment also monitors the effectiveness of those controls once they have been put into place. Because of the reason that the risk assessment maintains effective and up-to-date knowledge about the specific situation where we have threat. And in many respects, risk assessment is an underlying prerequisite to the conduct of the risk management function. They are needed because the systematic risk assessment can specifically direct the maintenance of the controls that the organization has to deploy to do substantive risk management. The targeted information ensures that the most effective use of security resources are used. So overall, the risk assessment is an information gathering function that focuses on understanding the nature of all faceable threats. So risk assessment identifies and evaluates each relevant threat, determines the potential impact of that threat, and defines the controls that needs to be done in order to respond properly. So in that respect, the risk management should provide risk assessment that should always answer two distinct but highly related questions. What is the certainty of the risk and what is the anticipated impact? The first one means the likelihood of occurrence of certain risk, while the second one gives you details about the estimate of loss, harm, failure, and so on. So all risk assessments provide two specific pieces of knowledge: the probability of occurrence, okay, and the estimate of the consequences, which is basically something that would answer to the questions that we already asked. So there is a logical sequence to how those two questions should be approached. Particularly speaking, for the first consideration, it has to be the likelihood, because a highly unlikely event might not be worth the cost of further consideration. However, it is the estimate of the consequences that truly shapes from what to respond and what can be left vulnerable. This is because there is never enough money to secure against absolutely every risk out there, and so the potential harm that each risk represents always has to be balanced against the likelihood of occurrence. For that reason, a fundamental goal of the risk assessment is to maximize the operational deployment of the organization risk controls. The risk assessment accomplishes that purpose by identifying existing and potential threats with the greatest probability of occurrence and those which will cause the greatest degree of harm. So once you create and you find the different vulnerabilities and threats, you can place them in a list in ascending order depending on the priority and then based on the resources available. So because of the fact that all decisions about the risk management process will depend on getting the correct order of all the priorities you have, and once you order your priorities, then it should be pretty easy to conduct an accurate risk assessment process and have an overall success in your risk management program. So you can see the next point here, that is that the risk assessment should be always built around a tangible evidence. The evidence is usually obtained by conducting interviews and documenting observations for both organizational and human behavior, as well as auditing the system logs and examining any other form of relevant technical and managerial records. So, because the sources of data related to the risk might be quite diverse, the collection process has to be systematic and very coordinated. As a consequence, every risk assessment should use commonly accepted and repeatable methodology, which will produce a concrete evidence that can be independently verified. So the gathering, comparison, analysis, and verification of data about risk could be, as you can see, quite time consuming and could really take a lot of resources. So in order to ensure the effectiveness and accuracy of any particular risk assessment, the practical scope of the inquiry has to be precisely defined and should be limited to a particular question or problem. So the risk assessment typically targets many standard areas of threat. Those can be electronic, humans, or physical resources. The insight gained from each assessment is gathered and then all insights are combined in order to build a single comprehensive understanding for the total threat picture, which serves as a basis for deciding how each threat will be addressed. Operationally, it is perfectly acceptable to approach the understanding of risk in a highly focused and compact manner as long as the organization understands that the results of any specific risk assignment categorize only part of the problem. In fact, the need to paint a detailed and accurate picture of all threats almost always implies a series of specifically triggered, highly integrated risk assessments that take place over a defined period. So that was everything that I wanted to share with you guys about the risk assessment. Thanks for watching, and in the next video we're going to talk about how to design an effective risk management strategies. Thanks for watching. Designing for effective risk management. Hi everyone! Since we already talked about the risk assessment, today we're going to dig a little bit more into how to design effective risk management, and I will give you all the core techniques and steps to build your effective risk management strategies. So as you can see, the topics we're going to talk about today are the context of the effective risk management, or how the risk management process is designed to fit particular environment. Then I'm going to move on to the scope and the boundaries, which is the next step after the context. And when talking about this, we're going to focus on how to define the actual assurance and understand the scope and the area of coverage of your risk management strategies. Once we have the scope, we will talk about the roles and the responsibilities, where we will learn how to decide to who to assign the responsibilities for dealing with risk management and how to manage our financial resources. Then we will learn how to categorize and prioritize the resource elements that are planned to be implemented into our organization. And finally, I will briefly touch the importance of the sensitivity of the information that you're working with. So let's get started. Now, every risk management process has to be designed in order to fit a very particular environment. The environmental considerations are one of the factors that have to be very well understood in order to fit the risk management process into the circumstances, in the particular circumstances of your organization. So when you are building this design, you should be able to describe all the factors that might impact the risk management process. So in the respect of the context, the design has to ensure that the process is correctly aligned with the environment, sensitivity, and security requirements within the operational context of your organization. This is because the organizational context always dictates the risk management approach that you use. For example, there will be a different set of risk management procedures where the operational context is top secret or highly secure and requires very rigorous approaches. And on the other side, you might have situations that the context is quite relaxed. So the result of that is that the operational context in which the process functions has to be clearly understood in order to design proper risk management approach. So once the context is actually into place, then it's time to talk about the area of coverage of your risk management strategies and this has to be very well understood. So the actual assurance of assets has to be explicitly defined. So the idea is that the definition should be a result of a formal planning exercise. You should meet with your team and discuss which assets require assurance and talk about prioritizing them. So formal planning is required because when the resources of your company are involved, you should really plan and see in what area how much you should invest, what risks are worth investing and what are not. So failure to define an accurate and realistic scope for the risk management process could result lower protection and waste of resources. So for that reason, distinctive and meaningful boundaries have to be established when you're conducting the risk management process. In particular, the logical relationship have to be understood between the different components of your plan, since the dependencies between various elements that fall under the risk management process have to be factored into the assurance process. So since the scope is always tied to actual resources available, understanding which components will be part of the risk management process and their actual dependencies will allow the organization to be more realistic about what will be able to protect. And this brings us to the next topic, which is roles and responsibilities. So defining those two is one of the most critical steps for designing the risk management function, because they include both employees and financial resources in all the activities that are part of the scope. It is quite important to explicitly clarify the duties that are associated with each of those roles. Otherwise, participants are likely to bring to the party their own assumptions about what they're supposed to do, which could result a very big cracks when dealing with important activities. So roles and responsibilities are created by designing accountability for performance of each security activity, as well as robust reporting associated with each role. In that respect, if third parties or contractors are responsible for any aspect of the risk management, the responsibilities and the reporting lines for both the contractors and your organization units must be clearly defined. You should always be aware about what your contractors should do and what information they can assess and what is the difference between them and your own employees. So after you do that, then it would be a time to define your priorities, and this is very important. So each of the resource elements has to be categorized in terms on their general priority. So priority is directly related to the criticality of the resources. It is essential to be able to know the priority of each component in order to decide how many resources to commit to the protection of that component. The determination of priority is based on a simple understanding of the purpose of each element, and the description of purpose should be aligned with the general importance of the element in the overall operating environment. So when you have a purpose, the decision of making that purpose should satisfy exactly two operational goals. The first one, it allows managers to make informed assignments of priorities for the protected components, and second, it allows managers to coordinate the implementation and the subsequent extension of the information assurance functions that are assigned to each component. So despite that, it is very important to specify the sensitivity for each piece of information within your organizational system. This is important because the sensitivity of the information determines the levels of CIA that are required. So this specification will provide the necessary basis for determining the extent of your controls. The specification will also provide the basis for deploying any of the selected risk controls that will be used to secure particular component or asset within your organization. So those specifications should not just be guided by a consideration of technical standards and protocols. In the minimum way, the specification of the sensitivity should be also considering politics, laws, and any relevant constraints that might affect the IT information within the system. The outcome of those specifications that you should create to address sensitivity should be detailed recommendations of how a particular requirement will be addressed by a specific control. In addition to that, the recommendation of each control should provide a justification for why that particular approach is taken. The aim of that justification is to explain the type and the relevant importance of the protection that you need. So each type of data and information that is processed by the system should be classified based on the severity and the potential negative impact on the organization and the degree to which the ability of the organization to perform its mission would be affected if the information has been compromised. So the sensitivity of information should be characterized based on the risk of this information to be compromised. So the highest risk would be associated with compromises that would adversely impact critical information or which might result loss of life, significant financial loss, threats to national security, or inability of the organization to perform its primary mission. So moderate risks would be those risks that might not compromise critical information, but where the losses would still have business impact. So low risk items would be those risks where information might be lost, but it would not be vital for the functioning of the organization. So that were, guys, all the 5 aspects for designing an effective risk management: context, scope and boundaries, roles and responsibilities, definition of priorities, and sensitivity of the information. You should follow those one by one, and you should meet the previous one that I mentioned before moving to the next. That's it. Thank you very much for watching that video, and in the next one we're going to talk how to evaluate the different assets and the candidates for control. Thanks for watching. Evaluating candidates for control. Hi guys! In this very short video we're going to talk about how you can evaluate the candidates in your organization for control. And by candidates I don't mean the people that are candidates in your company, but the candidates are those risks that are worth it to be controlled and your organization to invest resources in managing them. So the threats that are part of the risk environment of an organization need to be well understood before you take any precise actions to manage them. So all the threats has to be identified, their relationship with each other have to be well understood, and you should also consider the potential actions that those risks could take in order to cause harm to your organization. So this also needs to be characterized. So in order to evaluate and understand this, we're going to use the risk management framework stages. So understanding those stages would help to you and your organization to describe the cause in terms of harm and the likelihood of that harm to occur within your organization. So once you understand those factors, this will simplify the development of precisely targeted controls for each that deserves controlling. So for example, the modeling is one structured method which is used to analyze the risk-related data. So the successful threat modeling process requires a lot of creative thinking so that every reasonable threat should be put into table and assessed. Threat modeling allows risk data to be modeled and subsequently communicated among the team members. So the first major step in the modeling method begins with determination of the scope of protected space that the model corresponds to. So then the threats that might impact the components of that space are enumerated and specific details to the potential likelihood and impact of that threat are collected. So in order to make sure that the analyses are pretty comprehensive, you can definitely build data diagrams using the UML case-based diagrams, which are used for various tasks and can also be used in the cybersecurity. If you don't know, UML is actually also used in order to define, let's say, objects and classes when you're writing code, but it is also used when you're performing specific analysis. So those diagrams can be really helpful and ensure inclusive coverage. Descriptions of potential attack vectors and the impact of each of those vectors to the protected space are used to think through them and then describe the actual attack behavior. In that respect, all potential attack vectors should be able to be described and examined. So after you do that, this would be the first step. Then we're going to move to analyzing the implications of each threat. This analysis is mainly based on assigning certain criticality of the threats. This means which threat has higher probability to happen and which threat would cause the highest harm. Obviously, such threat would be with the highest criticality. So a standardized criticality score is an important part of the threat modeling process because it allows analyses that are performed by analyst employees to classify each identified threat in terms of likelihood and potential harm. The classification can lead to priority ordering of known threats from most dangerous to least dangerous. So this ordering will allow the management to concentrate resources on the threats that have the greatest potential of harm. It will also let managers assign fewer resources to lower priority threats. So in this classification process, this would allow managers to build logical, in-depth schemes. So when you're assigning priorities, guys, you always need to make sure that you're using some very specific quantitative and rational approach when placing priorities and criticalities to the potential attacks. And this is because without priorities to guide the implementation, it would happen quite often, and this is a negative thing, that the easiest to understand and the most obvious threats can be simply missed. Or if you apply this approach for adding priorities to the different items, you can easily see those and process them first. So in order to set the baseline for those priorities, or what are going to be the rules for assigning priorities to the risks, it is important to analyze previous attacks and previous effects of those attacks to your organization. Then based on this data, you can simply build the priorities and the criticalities. This process is called the threat modeling. So the threat modeling goes a long way toward putting quantitative and systematic implementation of measures to control risk in your company. So this is how you can easily decide what priorities to assign on the threats that your company faces. Thank you very much for watching. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about how to implement the risk management controls. Implementing risk management controls. Hi everyone! All the controls for risk management differ depending on their purpose and specifics. It is quite important for you to always keep those differences in mind when you're designing and then assigning control activities, because the people who will actually be executing each control need to know exactly how to perform all of those tasks that are necessary to make the control effective. So the consequence of that is the importance to ensure that management is not asked to perform highly technical tasks, and it is critical in the same way that the technical people are not asked to perform managerial activities. So in both cases, there is always the potential that the activities that underline the control could be either misunderstood or not applied properly. So knowledge of the existing operational status of the control, or even whether the control actually exists, it's quite important for the design process. This is because some controls will already be present in the previous schemes that you are using, or some legacy schemes, while others might not be created yet. For that reason, it is essential to have complete understanding of where a procedure is already been implemented and where it has been developed. This understanding is based on whether each necessary control item is operational and effective, or not as effective as originally planned. So if some parts of the control are implemented and others have only been planned, there should be an explicit specification on the parts of the control that are in place and the parts that are not. So where there are planned measures, this description should also include a list of resources required to take them into operation and the expected timeline for doing that. So the measures that you are planning can really be implemented in the proper way. In other situations, you might find that controls are desirable, but it would be neither cost-effective nor feasible to implement them. In this case, those controls should be noted in the future planning or implemented in your long-term monitoring plan for risk management. So here we'll continue by talking about the management controls, the technical controls, and the risk type. So let's first talk about the management controls. Obviously here those should include nothing technical. Management controls are mainly behavioral, and they're based on politics designed to employ organization and risk management procedures. So as an example, I can give you how you respond, what's your response to incident, security assessment, or the planning controls. All of those, they're related with management. So the nature of management controls is to manage risk through human-based actions rather than using technology. So those controls are typically designed based on risk analysis, which should support a comparison between the cost of applicable controls and the value of the information and the resources that those measurement controls are designed to protect. So as you can see, the measurement controls are basically designed and deployed based on the impact of the threats that they have been designed to address. It's important to design the appropriate administrative, physical, and personal security controls into the risk management process from the beginning. So because the risks come in number of forms, there can be extensive range and variety of different risk management controls. So the management controls are primarily enforced by the testing and the review process. So therefore, the design must ensure that tests are performed during the development of the risk management process. So the aim of those evaluations is to confirm that all the necessary controls are established as part of the risk management process. So once you ensure that your management controls are into place, then we can move to the technical controls. And even though they can deviate quite a lot from the management controls, they also should be well defined, understood, and followed consistently. So obviously, one of the most appropriate technical controls that can be applied is the access control system, or the access to users to information. So once you have a very good technical controls into place, you should make sure that those controls are taken care of and are monitored quite closely. So the monitoring of technical controls is an essential aspect of managing accountability as well as monitoring the technical issues. So in order to monitor the technical controls, we should always perform something called audit procedures by third parties. So a complete audit trail and a chronological record are evidence of adequate monitoring of the technical controls. For example, the use of the system log files to monitor system behavior is a great example of control because the developers can monitor those files and really identify where the issues are. And finally, let's talk about the risk type. So the risk type is exactly defining the classification and understanding the nature of the threats that are present in organization's current operating environment. In general, the threats can be classified in two categories, known and unknown. So if you are talking only about the known here, those are threats that are already available or that we're already aware about, while the unknown threats, also called asymmetric threats, are not predictable and are not subject to the management by our standard risk management method. So because of their inability for prediction, we can obviously not create specific techniques in order to analyze them. At the same time, the known threats are expected to occur. In many cases, the probability of occurrence and the subsequent impact of known risks can be estimated easily. They can be managed and monetized by implementing an effective risk management program. So in order to address the known risks, the organization has to adopt some kind of structured process to identify, classify, and provide meaningful response to the known risks that fall within the scope of the risk management process. So this is one of the most general aims of the risk management framework. The risk management framework process can be employed to organize and coordinate the risk identification, analysis, and planning activities. So areas of known risk can be classified into three main categories: management, operational, and technical. So you can use those three categories in some form of checklist in order for the managers to systematically address those risks. So the first category, or the management risk category, normally focuses on the potential risk on the organization information assets and documentation, as well as any risks that are associated with the assignment of roles and responsibilities, and those are normally represented by failures to properly conduct planning. They are very large areas of organizational functioning, so their analysis requires extensive coordination between the different departments. So for that reason, the analysis here require a very large number of participants among the company. So managers can use the identification and the assessment of the RMF process as a roadmap to guide the deployment of the necessary controls to ensure a persistent risk response. The second category includes operational risk. Those type of risks are much more focused and detailed. Operational risks involve threats to the operational environment that the organization has to manage, such as ensuring the identify management function and making sure that the identification and the authentication process is handled properly, and the long-term system maintenance and communication security functions are properly ensured. These areas require the coordination of complex managerial and technical activities. So because of the complexity, the assurance of those areas has to be detailed and closely controlled. The RMF stages allow managers to both coordinate the threats identification effort and collect a huge amount of data and process it. So finally, we're going to talk about the technical controls, and those normally include predictable threats to hardware or electronic systems. So the technical risk category even includes risks that are part of the cybersecurity education, training, and awareness function. Obviously, you need to have the right technical stuff to handle the technical controls. So because of the diversity and the inherent complexity of the technical controls, every technical risk area has to be very well defined in order to be properly analyzed. A checklist in terms of analysis is quite useful in handling this process and provides the necessary structure for the analysis. A checklist will also ensure that the right data is captured for each category and that the evaluational analysis of that data are appropriate. So this is how, guys, you can implement the risk management controls. Thanks for watching that video, and in the next one we're going to talk about assessing the risk controls and making them more effective. Thanks for watching. Assessment and effectiveness of risk controls. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the course. Today we're going to talk about the effectiveness of risk controls and how to assess them. So it is always important to have some form of process assessment as part of your management practice. By doing assessment, you understand very good whether or not your operational objectives have been met. It will also tell you whether the results that you got met your expectations and if the process that you started is under control. And you should understand that the risk management is actually no different than any other management activity, because good risk management requires appropriate measurement that accurately reflects the present sum of threats in your organization. So the proper assessment relies on the availability of meaningful standard measures. So having quantitative and quantitative measures is of key importance, and both of those can be used for your risk analysis. Both types of measurements allow the organization to prioritize its risks and responsibilities. They both assume that the risk can be analyzed, and that analysis can be used to deploy the controls necessary to manage risk. But let's talk about each of those separately. So let's first talk about the qualitative measurement. So this type of measurement does not actually utilize actual matrices, but instead it focuses on relative differences. So for example, you can create graph scales when building your qualitative analysis. So the main idea here is the comparison. So numbers of course can be used, but are really not necessary. So normally the final matrix of the qualitative risk assessment consists of threats that differentiates between different levels and likelihood of impact. So in the qualitative risk analysis, the measures that are used are descriptive, typically a set of nominal values such as high, medium, or low values. So to those categories are then assigned to numbers so that the weights of the relationships between them can really be characterized. So using those nominal values, it is now possible to distinguish between items receiving a score of high versus those receiving score of medium or low, for instance. However, in that case, it is not possible to truly rank the different elements of the same class. So the actual measurement here is actually not present, since we have only three categories, right? High, medium, and low. So since one of the main purposes of the risk analysis function is to determine priorities, in that terms, the qualitative analysis can be quite useful to really get vision on the big picture. So let's now talk about the other aspect and the other topic, which is the quantitative measurements. Obviously, the quantitative measurements are way more specific. They would really give you way better and detailed understanding of the risk situation when compared with the qualitative analysis. So the value of the quantitative methods pretty much depends on the quality of the data that we use. For example, if you use an actual data that is taken from specific records of birth or death cases, injury and loss, compared with some other factors that are well defined and analyzed, and putting them into a graph, that could build a really precise mathematical model for the situation. So those models can be created and organized by analysis, and the results from previous time periods can be compared with current values. So in the case of risk management, accurate and reliable measures are quite difficult, in some cases even impossible to obtain, especially with the ever-changing nature of the technology, which really restricts the time series studies. And by time series studies, I mean if you want to check certain activity or vulnerability of certain technology, that could be pretty difficult to do because this technology also changes. So for that reason, in practice, it's quite useful to use both blend of quantitative and qualitative measurements to gain the best understanding about the threat situation. That's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching that video, and in the next one we're going to talk about risk assessment, and we will learn how to perform operational evaluation of change. Thanks for watching.